Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. This is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. I'm Arjuna, and today I'm hosting a debate between Adi Purusha and TJump. Many of you will know TJump. He's on the YouTube scene a little bit in these debates. And Adi Purusha is currently completing his PhD from Cambridge University on the problem of evil. And he's also a fellow Hare Krishna. So let's get straight into it. The topic today is theism rational? We'll start with Adi Purusha giving his opening statement, and then TJump will give a statement, and then we'll have open discussion. So with that, I'll hand it over to Adi Purusha.
Cool. My argument is basically that well, I represent the Hare Krishna movement, or the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, and I argue that God is conceived within our tradition, as a supremely powerful personal God, triple O God, all powerful, all good. There are some differences between our conception of God and other conceptions of God. For example, we hold that God is polymorphic, so he can appear in a number of forms. He also is, he has both a personal and an impersonal feature. So he encompasses both aspects, but the personal. Yeah, my argument is that our conceptualization of God is rational, and the reason I say this is because one, I argue that our notion of God is logically consistent, and our theological framework is consistent. You can also, belief in God, who we call Krishna, is also confirmed by experience. There's spiritual practices you can do that can give you direct perception of God, or at least give you contact with God. I also argue that there's no real serious atheistic objections to Krishna's existence, and I also argue that Krishna, even though the way that we realize him is through our experience, and the way we know him is through scripture, ultimately, we can still defend his existence through reason. There's different natural theological arguments you could give to assert his existence, for example. So basically, I'm not necessarily saying you can prove the existence of God or Krishna, but I do argue that it's rational. And essentially, one of the perhaps best ways that you can know that Krishna truly exists is through experience. There's other way you could do some natural theological arguments to argue for his existence too, but really it's through experience is the foremost. So in our tradition, one of our main practices is the chanting of God's names, and we have this mantra, the Hare Krishna mantra, the Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And by chanting this mantra, you can begin to perceive God, and if you're very advanced, you can see God face to face. If you're sort of starting off in your spiritual journey and you're not quite that advanced, you can at least get a spiritual experience from chanting. So when you chant, you can feel a spiritual pleasure, and it's a spiritual pleasure that is self-evidently, spiritual, meaning it's phenomenally different than a material experience like eating potato chips or something. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Through chanting this mantra, you can basically begin to perceive God, and start to realize him and feel his presence more in your life. There's also some other things that happen as a result of chanting the mantra as well, that sort of reinforce the idea that you really are perceiving God or being in touch with him. One of that is by chanting God's names, you also purify your heart. So you start to eradicate some of the moral imperfections and impurities you may have, like lust or anger or greed or whatever. By chanting these moral imperfections, what we would call anarthas, start to become eradicated, and you can manifest more and more saintly qualities and begin to realize your true nature as a spiritual being. Um, so essentially, this is the way that we know God. Also, uh, I guess our epistemology has three valid ways of knowing things. One is sense perception, just it's pretty obvious. One's another inference, but really the way that we know God um, in full is through Scripture, and it's through Scripture that we can come to understand God. But like I said, Scripture, the truths of Scripture are also confirmed through experience. So experience also plays an important role. Um, there are perhaps some other arguments I could give for Krishna's existence. Maybe I could keep speaking, or maybe you want to butt in and say something, Tom.
Yeah, do you want to reply to some of those points, Tom, and then I can give some more arguments later?
Sure. So yeah, my opening would just be that for something to be rational, you have to have the belief proportional to the evidence, and for that belief to be proportional to the evidence, what you need is some kind of way to differentiate imagination from reality. If you can show that whatever claim you are making can be justified by some methodology that can effectively demonstrate the difference between imagination and reality, then it would be a rational belief. If you can't, then it's an irrational belief. So in order to have a belief in a God, one, you need some kind of novel testable predictions that could demonstrate it exists and have it repeated and demonstrated in a controlled experiment. Personal experience does not work. We know personal experience is a failed methodology that cannot differentiate imagination from reality. So you need some kind of testable, repeatable process that can be done in a scientific lab and get the results repeatably. And then you need to define the qualities of a God, like what do you think it actually is made of? If it's all powerful or whatever, and omnipotent or whatever, then you need something that can justify that claim, which is going to be rather difficult to come by because there's essentially nothing you could do to justify an all powerful being. Like even if you saw it create like universes forever, you could never know it could create infinitely many. You'd never know it was infinitely powerful. So there's absolutely nothing you could do to show something is infinitely powerful. So if that's a quality of our God, then you essentially have put yourself up against an impossible burden of proof because there's no way you can demonstrate that such a God exists, or at least there's no way you can methodologically justify such a belief. You could believe it's super powerful or really powerful, or more powerful than anything you could imagine, but you couldn't justify all powerful. So in order to justify, depending on the qualities of the God, in order to justify those kinds of omni properties requires some kind of new kind of evidence we've never discovered yet that could do the unthinkable, which we don't know of. And without that, then it is unjustifiable to believe in an all-powerful being whatsoever. The only thing you could do is justify belief in a super powerful being. And that's it. So unless my opponent can demonstrate that he has such a methodology, then his belief in the being would be unjustifiable. And I'll conclude there.
Okay. Yeah, those are some interesting points. Thinking which one to tackle first. So one, I kind of find it a little problematic to demand that spiritual truths be proved by the same way as empirical truths. Let's say that, like, you wanted a novel testable prediction in a scientific lab, for instance.
Well, so my criterion is you need some way to differentiate imagination from reality. Now, I use novel testable predictions for that. That's the confirmed way we know that can do that. If you have a different way, that's fine too. But you need some way to differentiate imagination from reality, or you have nothing. Because if you can't differentiate imagination from reality, then you have no reason to believe your conclusion isn't just imaginary.
Okay.
So do you have some way to differentiate imagination from reality?
Within our tradition, we do have criteria by which you can distinguish a genuine experience of God from some sort of delusory one. The criteria is that if you're, I guess, further advanced, when you chant God's names, you'll manifest various characteristics, like your hair may stand up on end. You may cry in ecstasy or something.
Wait.
But
So how exactly do any of those differentiate imagination from reality? Because those all happen for imaginary things. Like when you watch a
yeah,
scary movie and you imagine the alien is standing behind you, you get your hair standing on the back of your head, and
yeah,
you can get sensations of having people talk to you, like dead people talk to you all the time. That's a phenomenon that occurs with regularity in human existence. So, which none of the
yeah.
things you listed gives us a way to differentiate imagination from reality. They're just things that.
Yeah, well, I was going to add some more also. One is that
Well,
if
I mean,
you're
some more wouldn't do anything. It's all none of those have. So, could you have any that can? Can you just list one? Let's see if that can.
that distinguishes a genuine experience of God from a illusory one.
Well, it doesn't. I don't care about God. I care about anything. So, if you need some method that can differentiate imagination from reality. It doesn't need to be for God. It could be for literally anything. Like testable predictions work for rocks. So, if you could have some method that can differentiate imagination from reality for anything, that would be good. And then we can see if it works for anything. Then we could see if it works for God also.
There's no distinction. Well, I guess I'd still like to go back to the religious experiences. I, so if someone is, there's a way to basically tell if someone is sufficiently spiritually advanced in our tradition, and that's someone's level of spiritual advancement will sort of be indicative that they are having genuine experiences of God, and they are reaping the fruits of their spiritual practice.
Okay, go to that. You said there's some way you can tell if they're spiritually advanced enough.
Yeah,
That, as far as I know, that's an imaginary criterion. That's not a real criterion. So you need some way prior to that. How do you differentiate if this advanced level is actually a real thing, or if it's just things people made up, like the different levels of Scientology, clearly just made up, not real at all.
yeah.
So you need some method that can show us that these levels of uh, spirituality are actually real things. Like, how do you do that?
Someone who's spiritually advanced will manifest various moral qualities, I guess you can say.
Wait, what do you mean? Like there are moral people who have nothing to do with the God, so that doesn't seem to work. How does that differentiate imagination from reality? Because you can do it without belief in a God.
Mm, I guess our tradition would say that, like for instance, the Bhagavad Gita, one of our scriptures says that a advanced spiritualist, he will be free from anger, for example. He'll be peaceful. He won't lie. He'll be truthful. He'll be nonviolent. He'll manifest all these different qualities. And yes, it's true that someone could manifest these qualities without being spiritual. But one hallmark that someone is actually uh, genuinely advanced is that they will manifest these qualities. Granted, yes,
Um,
someone could manifest these qualities uh, without
Being
necessarily being
spiritual.
spiritual, but someone who is spiritual will manifest these qualities.
Okay,
So
so
if
again,
someone
how does
is,
that differentiate imagination from reality? Because if you can do it without the God thing, then the fact that you don't need the God thing to do it means that it could just be imaginary. So someone who just imagines a God or someone who imagines no God, they can both do this thing. Like I can pick up this cup, you can pick up this cup, anybody can pick up the cup, therefore you don't need a God to pick up the cup. So
mhm,
the action of picking up the cup would not be evidence of a God. So
mhm.
that also doesn't seem to be able to differentiate imagination from reality.
I guess how would you distinguish imagination from reality then?
Novel testable predictions, I can say if every idea starts as an idea in our
Hmm.
head. So we have a hypothesis. I think there's a God or a law of gravity or whatever. And if I think this law exists, then I can predict that if it exists, we're going to see these specific consequences that'll happen under these testable conditions. And we can do the test to find out if it's the case. And if I'm right and I get those predictions correct before we know them, then that's good evidence that my idea of what is in reality actually exists in reality outside of my imagination. So to summarize that, if I can have my idea in my head and use that to predict something about the world we don't know yet and get it right, that's good evidence that it's not just in my head, that my imagination is accurately describing something in reality. So that's how I would differentiate
Hmm.
imagination from reality.
So in order to distinguish something from imagination from reality, you have to be able to basically have a novel testable prediction.
That's the only way I know of that works. It's
Okay.
not the only way necessarily, but that's the way I know of that works.
But under that criterion, isn't there a lot of things that you can't really distinguish? For example, you can't really, through that criterion, prove that there's a real world that exists outside of our minds,
Hey,
or
Arjuna, can you mute your mic? Yeah.
okay.
All right. What were you
Yeah, I
saying?
guess, yeah. If in order to distinguish something from to distinguish illusion from reality, you have to have knowledge about prediction. Well, there's quite a lot of things that don't actually you can't really prove through that criteria. You can't, the external world, or that there's a real world that exists outside your mind. You can't prove that through
Yeah, you can.
scientific experimentation.
Yeah, you can.
You
It's
can
called
prove that.
fallibilism. So fallibilism says you don't require absolute certainty for knowledge. So I can say, if I predict there is an external world, and if I predict the external world has these qualities, like the law of gravity, I can predict that we'll discover the cosmic microwave background if we do build the whatever space thingy they did test that, and we build it and find out, oh, yep, it's there. And so that is good evidence that there is actually an external world. So most philosophers and scientists agree there is an external world purely based off of scientific evidence. You don't need to prove it with absolute certainty to actually demonstrate it's true.
Okay. So there's some degree. You basically acknowledge that there's some. It's not an absolutely infallible proof. Then it's just sort of you're going with the best explanation of the data.
Yeah,
And
it's probabilistic. So we have like 90-something% reliability. It could be in the matrix, but it doesn't make a difference to the testable predictions. But we don't need certainty. So that'd be, if I wouldn't ask for your methodology to require certainty either. It just has to indicate that it's not imaginary. And so if it can't differentiate, like if someone who's just imagining a god can do the same thing as someone who actually believes or if there really was a god, then that doesn't differentiate. So you don't need certainty, like that's fine, but you do need something that can show it's not just something in your head. Um,
yeah, I guess maybe we can come back to the idea that something is self-evident. There's many truths that we just sort of have to accept as self-evident truths,
I don't
like
think so.
the
I think there's
like the
one.
laws of logic, mathematical laws, belief in other minds, for example.
Yeah, those are all secondary facts. So I start with I think, therefore I am. Like I have an experience, and then from that I create languages called math and logic to describe that experience. They're not self-evident. They're just languages we humans made up to describe the stuff we're experiencing. They don't exist independent of human minds. They're just languages like English or Latin or French. So I don't like English isn't self-evident either. It's made up by humans, and same with math and logic. It's just a made up language by humans to describe things.
Do you think logic or math is all imaginary?
Yes, that is the consensus. The
And
first
they don't.
sentence of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is that logic is a formal language consisting of a systematic something, something, something. First sentence on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on classical logic, the page on classical logic.
Maybe a language, but it does still describe some sort of objective reality and some sort of objective laws that are out there.
All languages do that. Like there's a tree. Like English does that too. But languages have three different factors. There's sentences that describe reality, there's sentences that do not correspond to reality, and there's sentences that are self-contradictory. So in English, you have sentences that describe reality. There is a tree. That's perfectly fine. Sentences that do not describe reality. There is a Klingon, or like from Star Trek. Clearly, that doesn't describe reality. And sentences that are self-contradictory are like, I'm a married bachelor. Math has the same three categories of sentences. Sentences that describe reality, 1 + 1 = 2. Sentences that do not describe reality would be like F = ma times 42 or whatever. Just pick a number or whatever, and then take Newton's equations and just multiply it by that, and you'll get something that doesn't describe reality. And something that's self-contradictory, like 1 + 1 = 7. That would be a self-contradictory statement. So English, for math, is a language just like English, and some of the sentences can describe reality, some of them don't describe reality, and some of them are self-contradictory, just like any language.
So I guess to return to the original point. So you're wanting some sort of criterion by which you can distinguish reality from hallucination.
Yeah, imagination from reality.
I have a question about that logic point. Don't we use logic to know whether things accurately describe reality or not?
No, we use logic to describe reality, and then we can then use what we've described to infer other things. So, like, I exist, and then I can describe myself with A equals A. I am me, or reality is reality. And from that, we can get the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, follow from those things. And then once we have those laws, we can then describe other things. So it's not like we don't presuppose the laws of logic to discern things about reality. We infer them from our internal experience of ourselves. And then once we have those laws, we can apply them to other things. So, like, Newton described F equals ma by the apple story or whatever. And then you can apply that F equals ma to everything else also. Logic is the same way. It describes something we experience. And then once we have those laws, we can apply them to other things, but we don't presuppose them.
But what's the method by which we verify that the logic's describing reality?
It's a language. It's like, so you only need to differentiate imagination from reality if you're saying something's in reality. Logic isn't in reality. Logic is purely imagination. So it's not in reality. So it describes reality. That's fine. You don't need a methodology to say that languages describe reality. Like, you can just make up a word and it'll describe reality. Like, you can say that TV is a like, I don't need to verify that. It's just, I just made it up. So you only need to verify things if you're claiming something exists independent of your mind in reality. Logic doesn't, so you don't need to verify logic in that sense.
Okay, so but you would still need to verify the reality that logic describes.
Right. That's where the testable predictions come in.
But that reality that logic describes, there are certain logical laws like the law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, and if we take that logic as just a language that we use to describe these realities, then how do we still we're left with the question, how do we know that these objective realities which logic describes are true? You sort of have to take them as self-evident,
What?
don't you?
No. So again, logic, any reference to logic, anytime you say logic, language, full stop. So it doesn't exist anywhere except in our heads, nothing in our heads. And we don't have to confirm that it describes reality any more than I have to confirm tree describes reality. Like, you don't have to confirm, oh, someone invented the word tree, we're gonna have to prove that this actually refers to trees. Like, no, we just arbitrarily defined it that way. We don't prove that at all. So no, we don't have to confirm that we're using the language to describe things in reality. That's just what language means. It's like, we're not like scientifically have to prove that the word tree actually corresponds to trees. Like, no, you don't have to do that.
Isn't there a difference between naming and describing logical relationships?
Yeah, yeah, the referent of those.
No, those are the same thing. So, like, if I define a mammal as an animal with hair that has children or something, I forget what the definition of mammal is, and then a dog has hair, well, then by definition, a dog is a mammal. They're just by that way because of the definition. Or if I say a person is married if they have went to a church and got married under a pastor or whatever, then they're by definition not a bachelor. Like, these are definitions are all arbitrary conventions. There's not like logical entailments are also just definitional. Like, A equals B, B equals C, therefore C equals A. Those are all definitional. Um, so, like, if I said cats are dogs, dogs are chickens, therefore chickens are cats. Like, obviously that doesn't work because the definitions we have of those things correspond to something in reality, independent of the logic, independent of the definitions. Like, cat requires certain kinds of physiological properties that have been verified independent of the definitions. The definitions just don't matter. The empirical reality supersedes all the definitions and all the logic. So no, your point does not work. You do not verify the logical relationships. Those are all just definitional of the things we're describing in reality once we've discovered them.
Okay, uh, so I guess how would you understand something like the law of non-contradiction? So we say law of non-contradiction. It's sort of a logical law. That logic is a language we're using to describe some reality. How would you understand the reality that the law of non-contradiction describes then?
Through sense experience?
Through You can confirm that you can confirm the objective reality that logic describes when it says the law of non-contradiction through sense experience?
Law of non-contradiction doesn't describe anything. It's just the description of our experience. So yes, it is sense experience. I exist. I do not exist at the same time as I exist. That's the law of non-contradiction. It's just describing my existence. So yes, it's just descriptive of your existence. That's it. All logic, just descriptive. Every time. Consensus in philosophy. I don't know why you keep asking this. It's always going to be the same answer.
Well, that brings up a question, which is, can you get from observation to a universal or an absolute? Because logic gives us universal and absolutes.
Well, those are actually two different questions. You don't actually need logic. You don't need absolutes or universals. There's a positions, I think it's called nominalism. I don't remember whether it's
nominalism,
universals at all. That's a separate topic. Whether or not logic is a language and you can get to universals is a different topic. You can get to universals purely through empirical means in certain epistemologies. But that isn't related to whether or not logic is a language.
Well, generally it's thought that logic does give us universals, it's universally true that something cannot simultaneously be itself and not be itself.
No, so that's not actually the case. There are paraconsistent logics that say that there's certain things can be themselves and not themselves at the same time, and that is actually the consensus in physics due to quantum mechanics. So a particle can exist and not exist at the same time. So no, that isn't actually the case. But in certain viewpoints, reality is reality, yeah, that's a universal. But again, it's just describing the things that exist. But universals are, again, just how you get to them epistemically is irrelevant. Doesn't make a difference to the fact that logic is still a language. Some people say logic can, some people say logic can't. Depends on the epistemology. But doesn't have anything to do with whether or not logic's a language. People say you can get to universals through logic, rationalism. People say you can get to universals through sense experience, which is empiricism. Both of them can do that just fine.
I don't know if you want to keep going down the same line, Purusha, or
I guess so. To backtrack, I guess my original claim is that theism is rational. And let's say that someone has a given religious experience. There's two possibilities that are there. One is that it's illusory, it's delusional, it's not actually tracking reality that's God. Another possibility is that you are actually in encounter with God. And I'm not necessarily claiming that it follows with logical necessity that someone has the experience, they are indeed perceiving God. I'm mainly saying that it's genuinely metaphysically possible. And given that it's metaphysically possible, and given other things we know about theism and the coherence of it, that it's at least fully rational to believe that the experience you're having is indeed contact with God. And you'd have to prove with logical necessity that the experience is a delusion in order to discount that possibility.
No. So we know that most things people experience are delusional. So if you have an experience that is most likely delusional, just because everything is delusional. If you any mundane things this cup is a solid object, that's a delusion. This cup is actually 99% empty space between the electrons and the protons. Pretty much everything we experience is a delusion. So if you have an experience, it's a delusion. It starts as imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. You have to provide the burden of proof to show it's not imaginary, because it starts as imaginary. Most of the things we have are imaginary. We've imagined lots of things, and they've all been wrong. Even in science, pretty much every scientific theory has been wrong, and it's the most reliable source of data in all of human history. So no, any idea you have, you had an experience, it's just in your imagination until you can demonstrate otherwise, not the other way around. It's a burden of proof fallacy to assume that it's possible, therefore it's reasonable. It doesn't work that way.
So your claim is that everything's imaginary unless demonstrated otherwise.
Yep.
Isn't that a self-contradictory position? How you have to basically show that the claim everything's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise is not imaginary.
No, it is imaginary. It's just a statement. All statements are imaginary. So my statement, everything is imaginary until otherwise, is an imaginary statement.
And you don't find that to be self-contradictory?
No, again, logic and math are also imaginary. So you can use logic and say it's imaginary and make logical arguments perfectly fine. You don't need a contradiction if you think logic is something outside of your imagination. It's not. So you don't need to demonstrate it's not imaginary. It just is imaginary. It starts off as imaginary just like everything else.
Okay.
Or maybe to clarify,
Interesting.
imaginary doesn't mean false. Imaginary just means a thing that exists only in our heads. So, for example, this cup it starts off as something in my imagination, like I imagine it in my head, so it is an imaginary cup. And then if I have to show that it exists also outside of my imagination, so if I can show it exists empirically, then it's both imaginary because there's an image of it in my head, and it exists empirically because it exists outside of my head too. So when I say everything exists imaginary, it just means that's just the starting point. It doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily exist in reality. It just means that it's only an idea in our head. We only have reason to believe it's an idea in our head for now.
Okay. It's actually okay. That's a helpful clarification, I guess. Uh, everything is imaginary unless demonstrated otherwise. So you're saying that just if something is possible, metaphysically possible, it's genuinely conceivable, that we should just discount it right off the bat because of this criteria.
Yes, 99.99999% of all logical possibilities are imaginary. I can imagine unicorns and Klingons and $10 billion in my bank account. Like I can imagine lots of things. They're all imaginary. Like the fact that it's logically possible is not evidence it's true at all. It's just evidence it's imaginary. If that's actually literally what it means to be logically possible. It's just something, it doesn't have a logical contradiction in it, therefore you can imagine it. That's what it means. So like a square circle is not logically possible because it entails a contradiction, which means you can't imagine it. So that logically possible just means you can imagine it. Did he freeze?
Oh, has he frozen? Oh, looks like Adi Purusha is frozen. What to do? Yeah, I was going to make the point regarding if it's imaginary, then surely it could just be, we could say any statement, but what makes that statement different than me just saying something about unicorns or, the statement that everything's imaginary unless proven otherwise?
All statements are imaginary. That's why they're statements. All languages are imaginary. All sentences are imaginary. All math and logic is imaginary.
Right, but you said imaginary doesn't mean false. So why should we think of the claim about unicorns differently than we think about your claim that everything should be taken as imaginary until proven otherwise?
We shouldn't. We should take all claims as imaginary until proven otherwise. And then once we have empirical evidence that something exists outside of our imagination, then it's been proven otherwise. So unicorns is imaginary. We should consider imaginary. Horses are not imaginary, and we can demonstrate it because we have empirical evidence of horses.
I'm just asking how you justify that claim.
The same way I did in my opening. Like in order to show something isn't imaginary, I have to have an imaginary idea of a theory in my head and say, if it corresponds to reality, then I can predict something about reality that we don't know yet. And if I get it right, that's good evidence that it's something in reality, not just something in my head, because the ideas in my head don't control reality. Like I can't lift the TV up with my imagination. I can't generate gold bricks on when I will them to exist. It doesn't work. So my imagination doesn't control reality. So if I can predict something about reality that we don't know yet with my imagination, that's good evidence of the thing I'm imagining actually exists in reality, independent of my imagination.
I'm hoping he's going to hop back on, but anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Yes.
Did you catch it?
Yeah, the person. I think the last time I heard something about $1 billion and everything.
I just carried on because you hopped off for a minute. I asked him how he demonstrates his claim, and he said that we know his claim we know to be valid because. Sorry, what, do you want to just say it again? I lost my train of thought. Novel testable predictions. We know something. We know that things are imaginary unless proven otherwise, because we know things that can't produce novel testable predictions are imaginary, and things that do are not imaginary. That's how he backs up his claim that everything should be assumed as imaginary unless proven otherwise.
No, not really. Like we can imagine infinitely many things. Most of them don't exist. Therefore, everything is imaginary until demonstrated otherwise.
Well, that would just be taking it as self-evident. Well, most of the things you're just saying things that are logically possible are not necessarily part of reality, because we can imagine so many things that we never experience. But the question is, what about things that we do experience?
Oh, no. So it's like we can imagine things that are logically contradictory. I can imagine that I am older than I am or younger than I am. There's 2 of me, 10 of me. I can imagine that I'm not me. I can imagine lots of things. They're all contradictory. They can't all be true at the same time. Therefore, 99% of them are necessarily going to be imaginary just by definition. So, like, I can't be both a man and a woman at the same time. I can't be both 180 pounds and 10,000 pounds at the same time. I can't be on Earth and on Mars at the same time. Like, I can imagine all of these things, but they're contradictory statements. So we know that 99% of everything we imagine is imaginary. We just if you, I mean, if you want to doubt that and think that not everything we imagine is imaginary, I mean, okay, but you can just take that one up with the philosophers.
So I guess so. What was the thing you asked? So that was basically what you asked him then?
Yeah, I
Arjuna?
was just continuing with your same line of questioning of how he substantiates it. It sounds like he's saying we
can just skip going over that
seems to
again.
me you're
What
just
is-
assuming the laws of logic here that there's something logically possible. And
No.
because how do you know that
I already-
things?
I already
You're assuming the
looked at
law
this.
of identity or that mutually exclusive things can't exist in
No.
order to make that claim. No.
Nope. Again, I exist. I don't assume anything. There are no assumptions, no presuppositions in my worldview whatsoever. I start with the cogito. I think, therefore I am. I exist. From that, I can derive things like the law of logic, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, the mathematics. All of that just derives from my internal experience that I exist. I don't have to assume any of it.
I guess one practical problem of that view is that the goal of philosophy is to maximize your true beliefs and minimize your false beliefs. But you commit yourself to such a high degree of skepticism that you pretty much can't accept any belief whatsoever. So you're basically just
Nope, that's a straw
denying
man.
anything.
Like everything in my epistemology justifies everything that is accepted in the consensus of science and philosophy. So the only things it rejects are miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, and UFOs. So it rejects everything the consensus of experts rejects. So it's not highly skeptical at all. Except I'm a fallibilist, like pretty much every philosopher and scientist. So I don't require certainty for knowledge. So it doesn't in any way neglect anything that's accepted by the consensus of experts.
I'm not following what the steps are from I think, therefore I am to the laws of logic and the rest of your epistemology.
Okay, so I exist. I have this experience. I have experience of stuff, and I can then create languages to describe this experience of stuff. I have experience of TV. I'm going to give that a label. It's going to go called the TV. And I give experience of a camera. I'm going to give that a label and call it a camera. And the TV and the camera are 2 different things. So I'm going to call one itself and one not itself. Now look, I got the laws of logic. Damn, easy. And then from that, you can say, well, I can imagine things like I can imagine the TV is where the camera is, when the camera where the TV is, but that's clearly not the case because when I don't experience that. So I can imagine it but not experience it. So there's some difference between our imagination and our experience. So we need some method to differentiate between these 2 things. And I can imagine lots and lots of different imaginary things. I can imagine the camera anywhere in this room, but it's not. So there's 99% of them are all imaginary. So they're all just not the experiential stuff in reality. And so we need some methodology to differentiate between which one of these is the imaginary thing, which one of them is the real thing. The way we do that is we use novel tests and predictions. For a long line of the methodology of the philosophy of science, we use novel tests and predictions because they can confirm that something in our imagination is reliably a part of reality and not just a part of our imagination. If I can have an idea of what's in reality and use it to predict something we don't know yet and get it right, that's good evidence that my imagination is accurately corresponding to reality. It's not proof, doesn't need absolute certainty, which it's not required, but it is good evidence because we know that my imagination doesn't control reality. I can't lift the TV up, I can't create gold bricks, I can't move the camera with my mind doesn't control the stuff in reality. So if my mind can predict something about reality we don't know yet and get it right, that's good evidence that my idea corresponds to reality and is not just a part of my imagination. So that is how I go from cogito to logic to science. And then from science, we can get everything in science.
Do you want to continue down the same topic, Adi Purusha, or you want to take it in another direction?
Yeah, so it seems basically that you rule out the possibility of anything spiritual because it's can't be empirically tested.
Nope. Again, I rule out anything that you can't have a method to differentiate, is it imaginary or is it real? So anything you assert, you have the burden of proof. You need to provide some way to differentiate, is it real or is it imaginary? I have a method that I use, which is novel testable predictions. If you would need to provide, either use that method or provide a different method. I don't care what method you use, but you do need some method to differentiate imagination from reality. If you don't have that, then it is completely irrational to accept anything you're saying because it's only imaginary, or you only have reason to justifiably conclude it's imaginary.
Okay, I guess how about this criterion? So there's scripture, and scripture is held to provide knowledge of God. And let's say, we can't just conclude that scripture is false a priori. So, the scripture has truths about God. It gives you different characteristics that you'll experience if you have if you start chanting Hare Krishna, for example. It mentions if you chant Hare Krishna, you get this result, this result, and this result, and so on. So you take up, uh, you read scripture, you get an understanding of what the chanting of God's name is supposed to do, and then you begin to chant the mantra, and then you begin to get certain experiences. You experience certain things, and those experiences align with what Scripture has basically outlined.
Yeah, that's a prediction, but you need to be more specific. What about it is novel? Like if the prediction is the sun's going to rise tomorrow, like, yeah, that's going to happen, but that's not a novel prediction. You have to predict something we don't know yet. So if you're just predicting stuff we already know, that's not novel, not evidence. But yeah, that's a prediction. So how is that novel?
Why does it? Well, if you're having the experiences that Scripture is describing, that would seem to indicate that Scripture is a pretty reliable source of knowledge.
No, again, it has to be novel. Like I can write a book today that says the magical flying spaghetti monster says if you chant to the magical flying spaghetti monster, the sun will rise tomorrow. And every time you do it, the sun's going to rise tomorrow. But we already know that's going to happen. So if you're predicting something we already know, it's not evidence because we already know it. Like I can predict that if I like open the door over there, I'm going to see another door. Like that's not novel because I already know it. Which means it wouldn't be evidence of anything. Like I could just make up any theory I wanted and then write down a list of infinitely many predictions I can just think up off the top of my head of things I already know. The sun's going to rise tomorrow. The speed of light is 300,000 miles per hour, whatever, kilometers per second. Quantum mechanical particles can exist in knowledge at the same time. There are fossils in the ground, cosmic microwave background. I can predict all of those things by writing a book about the spaghetti monster today. Like obviously you wouldn't consider that evidence because I'm just taking all of the stuff science discovered or that we already knew about and just writing them in a book post hoc. So the only reason it would be evidence is if I could predict something we don't know yet. Like if I could predict what dark matter is, what dark energy is, what created the Big Bang, what the next big scientific discovery is going to be. Like if I could predict those things, that would be good evidence if I got them right. So if it's a novel prediction, something we don't know yet, that would be good evidence. That would be a justifiable reason to conclude that what you're saying is accurate description of reality. Just predicting things we already know would not be, because literally any one of the infinitely many hypotheses can already do that for literally every already known hypothesis. Evidence.
What about me chanting Hare Krishna and getting having certain spiritual experiences is something that we already know?
Well, it depends on like the spiritual experiences. Like if I had a spiritual experience of God giving me the lottery numbers and that actually works and I got them right every time, that would be good evidence for sure. But if my spiritual experience is I will see someone who I have an emotional connection with and who makes me feel all warm and fuzzy and gets stuff like my hairs on the back of my neck standing up, that's all stuff we know about in psychology and we've known about for hundreds of years. None of that's novel. That's more like the sun's going to rise again tomorrow. So it needs to be, depends on what experiences are there. And if they're just common things we already know in psychology, then they're not novel. They're just like saying the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Like obviously we already know that. So it has to be novel. It has to be the particular experiences you have to be something new that nothing else in psychology has already predicted or any other acceptable scientific prediction.
Well, I guess there's two questions there. One is it producing a result which isn't produced by another method? Like you chant Hare Krishna and you get one result. You chant Coca-Cola and you don't get that result. And I can't remember what the second one was.
Well, that wouldn't be evidence because the person doing the chanting and how the thing you're chanting is relevant to your life will affect the results. So like if I chant Hare Krishna, I don't get anything. I tried that with Josh and no effect. But if you chant Hare Krishna because it's so emotionally significant to your brain, through neuroplasticity, the chemicals being released because you chant it will cause you to have neurophysiological responses that I don't have. So what you would need is you need something that works for everybody, essentially. If chanting Hare Krishna could get us to talk to animals, like what Josh said, and get us to stop ants from moving on command, that's great evidence. But I'm willing to bet if you tried that in a scientific controlled experiment, it's going to fail every time. I'm so confident in that I'm probably not even going to waste my time trying it. But if you do that, publish a paper on it, that is great evidence.
Okay, so I guess one novel thing is that chanting Hare Krishna, you get I guess you can say like a spiritual pleasure, and it's a spiritual pleasure you haven't experienced anything before, that no one has experienced anything before. It's a type of pleasure that, um,
Well, if no one's
like,
experienced it, does that mean that you haven't either?
okay, no one who hasn't gotten that taste by chanting Hare Krishna has experienced it. So
Okay,
people
how do you,
who chant Hare Krishna and chant this mantra all experience who meet the necessary antecedent conditions for getting this spiritual pleasure.
fair enough, fair enough. So how would you differentiate your claim that you have this special feeling stuff from the Christian claim that they have this special feeling stuff from Jesus? Because it seems like you're both just making stuff up, and it's just a human chemical response that we know about through neurology and psychology, and there's absolutely nothing novel about that whatsoever. So you need to again use some method to differentiate your claim that this super emotional
Mm,
feeling you have is a real thing, not just something you imagine is real. Like you imagine it's something that no one else has experienced, but the reality is it's probably just the same neurophysiological responses everyone has for any type of super powerful emotional response. So how would
mm.
you demonstrate that your
Actually, yeah,
claim is
this brings up an interesting point. So our theology is not exclusivist. We hold that, like I said, God is polymorphic and he can appear before people in a variety of different ways. And the Christians, the Muslims, everyone that's worshiping God, we would say they're all worshiping Krishna. Maybe they have a slightly different conception of him, but Krishna can manifest himself before his devotees in different ways.
that's
So when
that's
I'm
that's totally fine. I'm totally happy to accept that, but that doesn't address my actual point. So my point was that this you claim that there is this super powerful emotional feeling. How do you differentiate it from imagination? And really, it's just the same as any other super powerful emotional feeling people get from
Mhm.
any other ideology that isn't the same as yours or doesn't align with yours.
Yeah, I guess maybe an analogy would help here. So if all you've eaten in your life is like unripe mangoes, you thought they were the real, you're eating unripe mangoes and you take them to just, this is what a mango tastes like.
Just sorry to interrupt, but yes, like Josh did the same thing. I've heard this
Oh,
before.
I think I've
But
done it too.
Um, my personal
okay.
experience of eating mangoes and then having a more tasty mango isn't evidence that this is some kind of novel psychological response, because having a new experience of a new flavor or whatever is just something that happens neurologically to everybody. It's just a common neurological brain function. So again, you need to show that this experience I'm having of eating rotten mangoes and ripe mangoes is somehow unique to the Hare Krishna ideology and not just a common feature of human psychology everywhere in the world. How do you differentiate those two things? If it's just a common feature, the same as every other feature, then there's nothing about this that's a novel prediction. So you need some way to show that this super powerful emotional thing is a real thing and not just a common psychological fact that happens to everybody regardless of the god belief.
Yeah, well, I guess the mango analogy, what it does is it shows that we have an ability to intuitively distinguish between different types of phenomenal experiences.
So again,
So we
that's
can,
an anecdote. So my ability to distinguish between two types of experiences doesn't show that these experiences aren't just common throughout human psychology or only related to Hare Krishna. So that doesn't help. The anecdote of me being able to have a new experience doesn't tell us anything about whether or not the experience I'm having is something that's common throughout humanity and relative to all belief systems, or if it's a specific one to Hare Krishna. So you can't just use my personal experience or your personal experience or the personal experience of others to say, well, I have a different feeling chanting this mantra than this other one, because everybody has a different feeling when they're talking about their preferred religious doctrine or their preferred political doctrine, their preferred ideological doctrine. Everybody has a different experience. You would need to prove somehow that there is some significant magnitude difference here between your belief and your chanting of Hare Krishna and someone chanting Donald Trump, lock her up or whatever.
Well, I guess there's there's material things you can chant, like you can chant Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, and there's spiritual things you can chant, like God's name, and that includes people in different traditions who may chant the name of Jesus or Allah, for example. And I think basically you can take all these people together, and whenever they chant the spiritual mantra of their choice, they have a different perception or different experience than when they chant some sort of material mantra. I mean, you may not say that's proof. You may say there's some.
No, I think
Um,
that's perfectly fair. I would just say that it's demonstrably false. Like when people chant mantras of their favorite sports team, the ole, 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 like that kind of thing, they get the same kind of spiritual response to when they're chanting the prayers of Jesus or Hare Krishna
mm,
or whoever. fMRIs show that these are the same kinds of responses. Same kinds of responses when people are chanting "Lock her up" at Donald Trump rallies.
mm,
It's just that kind of a response we know is a social response to any kind of ideology that's significant to you. There's nothing about that experience that is unique to religious beliefs or personal deities or Hare Krishna. Like that's all just stuff that we commonly know about in psychology. None of the stuff you've described is a novel prediction. It's just stuff we already know about from psychology. So what about that do you think is how do you show that your belief in Hare Krishna can actually give you this novel thing that not everyone else has already experienced in just talking about football?
Adi, do you want to talk about transformations of character?
yeah, that's one point. People who chant the mantra do often. Also, people who chant Hare Krishna, not all of them are like born in the Hare Krishna movement. For example, a lot of them have experience going to football games, and a lot of them have experience doing all sorts of things. Political rallies, and they have experience doing these sort of group collective activities that would
Yep,
give you
yep,
this
I
type of.
totally agree, but that doesn't mean that their personal experience of football corresponds to everyone else's. So just like how they go to football and they don't feel that euphoria from chanting the Ole song, other people go to Hare Krishna and don't feel that euphoria from chanting Hare Krishna, but they do feel it from the Ole Ole. Different people feel different euphoria from different things. That's why
Yeah.
everyone have different religions and different hobbies and different ideological things. So the fact that not everyone feels it from everything is obviously something we already know from psychology. So how again, nothing you presented actually gives us a novel prediction that we just don't know in psychology.
Well, you concluded that people who were Hare Krishnas or weren't, okay, who became Hare Krishnas didn't experience something at these events, but there are plenty of examples of people that went to these events did actually experience these types of group
Well, no,
collective
no.
feelings
So,
that
so
everyone
I
experiences.
wasn't saying they didn't experience anything. I'm saying that you can't compare the magnitude of one person's experience to another. So, for example, one person who goes to a football game and does not feel as much euphoria chanting the football theme as they do for Hare Krishna does not mean that's true for all people. So that doesn't mean that all people have the same level of euphoria from chanting Ole, and then the Hare Krishna just discovered this new thing to give more euphoria. That's not how it works. Everyone feels a different level of euphoria depending on their ideology and their background and their neuroplasticity and the chemicals in their brain. And so the fact that the Hare Krishna did not feel as much euphoria from the football game doesn't mean that the other person isn't feeling more euphoria than they were. So that again, that isn't evidence that their belief is true. Again, same thing. We already know about this from psychology. This isn't novel.
Okay, just give me a second. I guess one other point is that one, the chanting of Hare Krishna requires certain conditions that be met in order to get the euphoria. And these conditions are important because, basically you have to have your heart open to God to have these experiences. That's why some people chant the Hare Krishna mantra, they don't feel anything. Some people chant it, they, feel ecstasy. Because there's certain antecedent conditions that one needs to meet in order to have the particular experiences. But another point is that, actually, let me give an analogy. So let's say there's three people in a room and they can all see, and then they see some red object and they all observe that object, and then some blind person walks in the room and he says, oh, you three people are all delusory. We wouldn't take that blind person's account very seriously because he doesn't meet the epistemic conditions to perceive that object. So in the same way, everyone who meets these antecedent conditions for having a spiritual experience, all of them, those that meet the necessary conditions, experience something when they chant, and that something is basically uniform. Like they don't experience different types of things. They all agree on a common universal experience when they chant the mantra and they meet the certain conditions. And now let's say someone who doesn't meet those conditions chants the mantra, says, "Oh, I didn't feel anything. You guys are all delusory." I think the person who doesn't meet the conditions and tries to deny that these three other people are having a genuine spiritual experience is just simply not within his epistemic rights to draw that conclusion. Unless you're actually meeting those conditions, experience what they're like, you can't really conclusively deny that they are experiencing something spiritual. You at least have to acknowledge that it's a genuine possibility that they could be experiencing something spiritual, and I simply don't have the epistemic credentials to be able to perceive that thing.
Epistemic warrant, again, comes from having a way to differentiate imagination from reality. Just having a different method that you presuppose works isn't a usable method. So, for example, if we bring a homeopather, a dowser, and a astrologer into a room and say, "Well, find the magical cup or whatever," and one says it's over there, and one says it's over there, and one says it's over there, none of them have an epistemic warrant because there's no way to show that this magic cup exists outside of our imagination. They all have different imaginary methods they think work, but until you can independently verify that their method actually works in reality, like when you mentioned the blind man, people who see the cup, that's not a methodology we use. We use novel testable predictions. If we can show the cup is there, and then the people who could see it are justified in believing it's there because they have a combination of that scientific verification in addition to their personal experience. But if it's just their personal experience, that's nothing. It's essentially just imagination, hasn't been demonstrated to be reality. So if you have an imaginary method that you think gives you a euphoric feeling, that still doesn't give us a way to show this isn't imaginary. You still need some independent method to show this is not an imaginary thing you're feeling, just like the person who likes the sports teams more than the religious thing is feeling the exact same euphoria towards their sports team that you are feeling towards your God. That seems to be the reasonable conclusion based on all of the evidence. There doesn't seem to be anything special about the Hare Krishna mantra or the feeling people get. It just seems to be the common sense of euphoria you get from certain kinds of ideological motivations that occur when you chant in a certain social background towards things that you have a dogmatic conviction to. There's nothing about what you said is novel or that we don't already know about from psychology.
Yeah, I just it seems like a very stringent criteria for proof. I mean, nothing you've shown really rules out the possibility that someone could be having a genuine spiritual experience. I mean, I think that's option is still on the table. Someone.
I'm not arguing it's impossible. Like you could have a magical leprechaun in your pocket. I mean, that's definitely a possibility too. But again, it's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. You would need to meet the burden of proof. Just saying it's possible doesn't do that. Well, anything is possible that isn't a logical contradiction. I could be God, and you just wouldn't know it. But it's not reasonable to believe that just because it's possible. Or I could be your dad. That's not logically possible either. But again, it wouldn't be reasonable to believe it just because it's possible.
I don't see how the empirical proof we can have that a cup exists could carry over to God, because how could we have something like that for a God who isn't available for empirical investigation?
Well, we definitely could have empirical investigation of a God. Like if I could pray to Hare Krishna and Hare Krishna would give me a gold brick every time I prayed to him, that would be great evidence of Hare Krishna. That's a novel testable prediction of a new phenomenon that no one in science predicts, that if it occurred, it would definitely be new, and it would be confirmed evidence, empirical evidence of your God, even if your God isn't empirical. So any kind of novel testable predictions would work for a God for sure. Like if you don't think God would do any of these kinds of things, that would mean that you don't have a way to demonstrate your God is not imaginary. This is why in the past we have lots of different ideas of a God like Zeus or whatever. Zeus was a guy in the clouds, and that was something that could be empirically demonstrated. We could go above the clouds with the plane and see, oh, no Zeus, so there's nothing there. And so religions have evolved to rule out all of the things that can be empirically verified because they're proven false every time they make those kinds of claims, which is why the only religions that are left are the ones that don't make any kinds of claims that can demonstrate they're not imaginary, because if they do that, they're going to be proven false. That's why falsification is such an important thing in science. So the fact that your idea of a God doesn't provide a way to differentiate imagination from reality doesn't mean we shouldn't apply science to it. It means that you need to find some way to show it it's not imaginary and not just believe it on blind faith.
I guess one, you sort of you mentioned that every time you chant Hare Krishna, you get like a gold brick or something. One, it seems kind of if God is a person, it seems kind of strange to demand that he reveal himself in a manner that conforms with what we want in our epistemological parameters. I find that a little bit strange. But also, there is a way that okay, you chant Hare Krishna, you may not get a golden brick, but one thing that happens is you chant and you actually can perceive that your heart becomes purified and you sort of remove some impurities within your heart. You become a more moral person. You hold on to less pride. You experience less anger. You feel more peaceful. You feel less materialistic. There's all these things that you can actually perceive within yourself by chanting this mantra. So when you chant the mantra,
is just an anecdote. It doesn't mean anything. It's just I can perceive within myself anything I want if I just do whatever I want. So I can perceive all of those things in myself when I rub a magic stone or have some magical crystals cleanse my aura, or take some homeopathic medicine that's just water that's been diluted over and over again. Like, all of those things are just common psychological things that happen to all humans all the time because our brains don't work. It's all just stuff we've made up in our heads. Again,
I've yet to see someone that rubs a magic stone and actually develops better, genuinely develops saintly character because of rubbing a stone. I mean, how many people rub crystals or rub stones and develop good moral character?
More than there are Hare Krishnas. So homeopathy and alternative medicine is actually a more common belief system than most religion believes, except for like Christianity and Islam. And so there are actually more people who have significant moral changings in who they are due to Reiki and homeopathy and yoga than there are for Hare Krishna or Hinduism. I think actually, like in the UK, homeopathy and alternative medicine is actually one of the largest weird beliefs they have, which is so there's lots and lots of there's millions of people who are changed through those things or attest to be changed. We definitely know they don't work, but this super common feature of humanity to adopt an ideology and then to having belief or conviction in that ideology change you emotionally. It's just a common feature of human psychology. Happens for any belief system.
I did have an interesting experience with the amethyst crystal when I was 16 and like an alcoholic and all that sort of stuff. Someone gave me an amethyst crystal and I held it in my hand for and meditated with it heaps. And then I gave up alcohol after that. And then I looked it up, and amethyst is supposed to make you give up intoxication. So, and that was my experience with it before. We're not knowing anything and then reading about it after the fact, but that's kind of a tangential. I think that the transformation of consciousness point is interesting. Like with the football game, people go to the football game and they experience some euphoria, but it doesn't really change people's character for the better so much. I mean, unless they're really low beforehand, but usually, there's a certain type of character that it might bring you up to, but you won't go beyond that. But then those people might go and have euphoric experiences, which they claim are higher in chanting Hare Krishna and practicing Krishna consciousness, and it transforms their character to a greater degree, arguably.
Right, because transformations of character happen due to the doctrines of the ideology. Football doesn't have any doctrines. It's not like you should be a good person so that your football team is going to win. Like, no one cares. What they want is for you to spend money on like merchandise. That's the character change you're going to see with someone who's super indoctrinated into a sports team. So there's always going to be a character change with the ideology depending upon what the ideology tells you to do. So if you're, for example, a Marxist or, for example, a Stalinist, and you have a character change to adopt the kinds of tenets of Marxism and Stalinism, you'll see a character change in accordance with those kinds of ideas. Or if you're a humanist, you'll see a character change in accordance with humanism. Or if you're a Christian, you'll have a character change in accordance to whichever denomination of Christian you are. The character changes you see are specifically due to the doctrines of the belief in which you are motivated by. And so obviously, as a Hare Krishna, in Hinduism and Buddhism and those kinds of ideologies say, save all suffering beings everywhere and don't harm anything unnecessarily. Like, obviously, you're going to have a moral change in the direction of those kinds of ideologies. Like Jains, I remember Sam Harris uses this example of Jainism. Extremist Jains are a danger to no one because that just means they're never going to hurt anyone because they're going to like wear cheesecloth to protect their mouths so that they don't kill flies or whatever. Being an extremist or having those kinds of um, personality changes in accordance with the doctrine isn't special. Again, same thing we know about every ideology. It just depends on what the doctrine of the ideology is. So it's not really a surprise that adopting a moral ideology like Hare Krishna is going to make people better than adopting football and buying merchandise.
Well, I mean, a religious ideology improving someone's character fits within our version of inclusivism. But then you gave the example of Marxism and so on, and they don't really change people's character. They just disguise their vices. You know, if somebody's is filled with hate and they take to Marxism, they just transfer their hate into and express it in a different way. You know, like someone goes into black, you know, they could be a racist and they hate black people, and then they become a Black Lives Matter supporter, and now they hate white people.
No, so again, the point here is that any kind of ideology has certain kinds of doctrines, or some kind that you're going to try to get people to abide by. And you use the basic human emotions, fight, flight, fear, sexual reproduction, achievement, acceptance, belonging, and accomplishment, and you use those things to leverage people to do these doctrines. So when you're transferring your vices in a way, they're not transferring their vices. What's happening is that they're a change in their personality. They had a specific proclivity, which was then changed by the doctrine they adopted. It's changed in a different way because the doctrine was different than Hare Krishna, but the change is the same. It's not a new kind of feature that only exists in Hare Krishna. They're cherry picking a certain kind of a change that they're trying to get out of the ideology of Hare Krishna. So, for example, if you want to say the prosperity gospel had a change in people's lifestyle of the way they manage money, and they therefore started to earn more money, that's not a moral change in the way that the Hare Krishna would see it, but it is a change in personality. And so just like you say that a Hare Krishna is going to experience this kind of moral change in who they are from chanting the Hare Krishna, a prosperity gospel person is going to say you're going to have this change in your financial system of your ability to manage money because you adopted the prosperity gospel. The same change occurs, but the focus is just based on whatever the doctrine is prioritizes. There's nothing special about this. The fact that you just prioritize moral teachings in Hare Krishna just means those are the ones that your ideology is going to cause a change in if people adopt it, which is, again, true of any ideology, including humanism, secular humanism, any kind of moral secular framework. The same thing occurs. Veganism, vegetarianism, same thing. There's nothing special about that. There's, again, just common facts we've already known in psychology for 500 years.
I think the point remains that, you know, let's take hate for the example that, like, you know, you take up Marxism or you take up whatever. There's so much evidence that, like, you know, people that push for socialism, it's not so much that they like the poor, it's that they hate the rich. And you see this hatred coming out and all the violence that goes on when these ideologies take power. And again, with the religious ones, we can explain that. What the real amazing thing is if you can remove hate from somebody's heart. And I don't see material processes doing that so well. I mean, you do get veganism, but then you get vegans hating people who aren't vegan.
So I already addressed that. Like, literally anything that your ideology focuses on is going to be the change you see in people's minds. It's that simple. If your ideology focuses on more moral propositions, that's what's going to change in people. If your ideology focuses on more disseminating ideas that dislike people, then that's what's going to change in people. There's nothing special about this. If your ideology focuses on moral things, obviously it's going to cause a moral change in people. If humanism or materialism things cause a moral change in people, you're going to see the exact same change in people. There's no difference whatsoever. Again, already known in psychology, past 500 years, we've already demonstrated this, proven it in the lab. The same thing you see in Hare Krishna, you see in every other religion. There's actually more of it in Jainism. If you convert to Jainism, you see more of a moral switch in people than Hare Krishna or other religions that are not as focused on morality. It's just the doctrines of the ideology and your conviction to them. There's nothing special about this at all.
I'm supposed to be moderating, but I can't help myself. I'll probably get told off in the comments.
I guess, well, maybe one other, historically, theists have also put forth natural theological arguments for the existence of God. And what these do is that they at least show that we have a reality. I have a reality, and you can argue that theism explains our reality better than just a strictly atheistic naturalistic account. And I think one thing that distinguishes Hare Krishna from maybe crystals or whatever is that someone has an experience of God. Let's say you discount that, but still, the existence of God also. I would say that a theistic worldview just makes more sense than a strictly naturalistic atheistic worldview. And I think we see in our world that there's certain things that naturalism, just a strictly naturalistic account, has difficulty explaining. For instance, one thing is the origin of life.
Get some water. My throat's drying up.
Cool. Oh yeah, he won't be able to hear us because his headphones. Anyway, tomorrow we've got another YouTube event. It's me and Graham Oppie. Dr. Howard Resnick is needing to take rest for health reasons, so he's pulled out, and it's me and Dr. Oppie tomorrow. So make sure you tune in for that. And we've got Tom back, so you can continue, Adi Purusha.
You see my origin of life?
Yeah, so there's certain things in our world that a strictly naturalistic account has a very difficult time explaining. One thing is, for example, the fact that we have a universe that supports life is, rather odd. Many philosophers have teleological arguments, but there's other things like the origin of life, for example. Scientists have tried to produce life. They haven't really been able to yet. And scientists sort of speculate how life could have arose, and they do these complicated equations, but still they have yet to prove they still have yet to observe life arising just from strictly naturalistic processes. They've yet to have a testable hypothesis that shows that we can produce life through naturalistic processes. So there's instances like that seems like there's a good theistic explanation for certain things that naturalism has a hard time explaining. Similarly, you could also say that.
So origin of life, again, we need some way to differentiate imagination from reality. The way we do that is novel testable predictions. If we take the two competing hypotheses, naturalism versus theism, and say, well, which one makes testable predictions that have been confirmed? Naturalism has made all the testable predictions. Theism has made none. All of the progress in biology and abiogenesis has been done on a purely natural basis. The RNA on clay, the corpuscles being formed by proteins on natural processes, all of the things that have been done to show that life can form by purely natural processes has been predictions made by the natural hypothesis that have been confirmed at an extremely high rate. All of the evidence indicates that abiogenesis is going to be completely natural. There's no evidence to conclude it's supernatural or theistic at all, which is why, again, the vast majority of everyone in biology and geology and every scientific field is an atheist in this field. So when you say that it makes more sense under theism, like the consensus of experts doesn't agree with you at all. So I don't know where you're getting that when all of the test predictions have been confirmed by naturalism. All of the evidence supports naturalism. All of the experts conclude it's natural. I don't know why you think it makes more sense under a theistic hypothesis.
Have you heard of James Tour?
Yep.
Yeah, he's also he's basically addressed this. All the experiments, basically, they have yet to actually produce a living being. They can maybe produce biological pieces, but as far as I'm aware, the scientists have yet to actually produce a self-replicating organism.
Yeah, that's
They've yet
true.
to produce it.
We haven't discovered the exact origin of life yet, but we don't need to. Like, again, we haven't observed the Big Bang directly either. We haven't observed what happened 10,000 years ago in evolution, but we have observed things that are responsible or things that are a result of those things. So we don't need to directly observe the origin of life. We know the origin of life is a result of natural processes. All we need to do is say, here is, if we predict that the origin of life is a natural process, we will predict that if we put clay and these chemicals in a lab and let them grow, then it will result in RNA, and RNA can make DNA, and then DNA can produce the proteins that are then lead to the process of making cells. So if we can use the natural hypothesis to create an idea of what we think could happen, then do an experiment in a lab and confirm that that's a perfectly reasonable way that can be happening in a lab, then we can infer from that, if we continue down the process for the tens of millions of years that evolution occurred, we can get to a cell. So obviously we haven't gotten to a cell because it takes tens of millions of years processes to a complex organism like a cell. But if we can make all of the building blocks in a lab, that that is a confirmation of the hypothesis. Good evidence to support the hypothesis that it is going to be purely natural, whereas there is no predictions that have been made by the theist side. So all of the evidence that shows that one of these hypotheses is not imaginary is on the atheist side. We've made the predictions, we've made the confirmations. That's evidence for our side that yours doesn't have. So ours is by definition more supported and more reasonable. But yeah, you're right. We haven't the entire cell yet, but we don't need to.
Well, I think that's a bold claim to say that you don't need to. I think you would. That's sort of like a question begging naturalism. We've made the parts. Okay, you can make the parts, but put the parts together and make a living being. Because so at least in a theistic worldview, every living being is like a spiritual being, a soul. And if you say that naturalism will figure it out, definitely will, you're sort of presupposing the idea that life doesn't have a soul. There is no soul or spiritual entity responsible for consciousness. So we just get the parts, assemble it together, will produce life. But that presupposes that life is not due to the influence of a soul. But that's basically the conclusion that you're trying to deny, but you're assuming it already in order to draw it. So it's circular reasoning in that respect.
Again, the soul, the idea that there is some additional thing to the physical body is, again, imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. So there's no evidence to support that's actually true. So until you can actually demonstrate there is a soul that needs to be accounted for, then it's not even something science cares about because there's no evidence to support it. It's like there's no reason to believe there's Klingons or unicorns. We don't need to explain those things because we have no evidence they exist, which is why the consensus in neurology and psychology and cognitive science is that the brain is the mind and there's nothing more to it because there is no evidence of there being a soul. So when we're talking about the origin of life, the only thing we're explaining is DNA. Like, what is the DNA? What produces the cell? Because that explains everything in life. There isn't anything it doesn't explain about life. It's just all life is just DNA, different combinations of DNA. So if we can explain how the DNA originated by natural processes, we've explained life. That's all you need to explain abiogenesis is how do you get DNA, self-replicating molecules that can then form into cells and create proteins and then form and start the Darwinian process of natural selection and evolution, then you get life and you get all the diversity of species. That's all you need to explain the origin of life. So I don't know. When you say we're presupposing that there is no soul, that's burden of proof fallacy. You would first need to show there is one. Just give us a reason to think there is that thing exists outside of our imagination before it would be reasonable to conclude in the first place. We can't. It's not that we're being circular. You just have no reason to believe it exists. There's no evidence for it yet.
That's basically ruling out the possibility a priori. I mean, it's definitely conceivable that every living being has a soul, and you're basically ruling that out, until you can prove it, but you can't disprove it either.
No, I think you're muted.
It's, if you can't prove it.
No.
If you can't.
Chom's muted. You're fine.
If you can't disprove it or you can't prove it, then you haven't conclusively proven that it's wrong. It's still rational to believe that such a thing could exist.
Yeah, I think we can hear you now.
You guys can hear me now?
Yeah.
Just testing. Yeah, my dogs are barking, so I tried to mute that. So yeah, no, I rule out nothing a priori. There's nothing that's ever ruled out a priori in science. It doesn't work that way. The reason we don't believe in a soul is because you have no evidence of a soul. If you provided evidence, we'd believe in it. It's that simple. If you have a hypothesis, you have the burden of proof to show that it exists and is real and not imaginary. Until you do that, it's just imaginary. And we're not going to try and justify imaginary things. We're not going to try and prove or disprove Klingons or unicorns or souls or free will because there's no evidence to support it. So until you can actually provide evidence that it exists independent of your imagination, then we don't need to explain it. There's no burden of proof there because you have no evidence. So it's not a priori excluding it. We're totally happy to admit the souls are possible. So are Klingons and unicorns. But until you provide evidence they are real and not imaginary, we don't have any reason to justify them. We don't have to support that as a possibility because you haven't provided any evidence for it. It's just an imaginary hypothesis.
Well, the soul is immaterial, so you can never really empirically prove it. But if you're basically assuming that things are only real if you can empirically prove it, then you're ruling out things like souls a priori. What if there is a spiritual dimension of reality and there are certain immaterial things and those immaterial things aren't proved on the basis of sort of scientific methods.
Remember what I said in my opening, you need some way to differentiate imagination from reality. So the empirical method is just the method I use. You can't just keep saying it's a priori. You can't just keep blaming the empirical method. This is on you. If you can't show it's not imaginary, then it's imaginary. Nothing about my method matters. Nothing about my epistemology matters. I don't a priori exclude everything. I'm not an empiricist. I don't say empiricism is the only way to knowledge, but nothing about my ideas matters. If you can't show that your hypothesis isn't imaginary, then it's imaginary. And you can't just blame it on me because you don't have the evidence to support your belief. I'm not being unfair excluding your imaginary hypothesis. You hold the burden to show it's not imaginary, not me.
Hmm.
I'm wondering what evidence for the soul might look like.
Novel testable predictions I'd accept, but you can come up with any method you want that works that can differentiate. I had a conversation about this recently on Discord. If I predict souls exist, I can predict that I'm going to call my dead Uncle Bob and he's going to tell me where his buried treasure chest is. And so if I can call my dead Uncle Bob, he responds, he tells me where my his treasure chest is, I can dig it up, find his buried treasure. That would be great evidence of a soul. That would work.
Seems that I mean, there is some evidence that points to the idea that reincarnation is there. For example, Dr. Ian Stevenson's experiments, if you're familiar with those. I mean, basically, he's found that there's some children, and they recall having memories of their past life, and those memories of their past life are sort of it's too odd for it to just be a coincidence that they're just guessing, making everything up. They remember specific family members. They remember parts where they, played in their childhood. They remember family members by name, which they haven't met in this current life. He's found all these findings, and it's a pretty convincing. Well, I guess people interpret that evidence differently. That's the thing. Some people see that evidence and they say, okay, this is pretty clear that this is evidence for a soul, for example. Some people sort of don't want to accept that there could be such a thing as a soul, so they find some sort of other way to explain it. But I think if you look at it objectively, the fact that they're the same soul reincarnating to a different body makes perfect sense of the data.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the wiki for them right now, and then you can go to reception, and they give you a list of why the consensus doesn't accept these. Like, critics suggest the children on their parents had deceived them, and that he was too willing to believe them, and that he was asked them leading questions. In addition, critics said blah 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 blah. Like, none of that's accepted by the consensus. Like, that would be great evidence if it worked, but the people who are qualified enough to assess whether or not it worked says it didn't. They
Well, one,
looked
that's
at it.
a Wikipedia page, but two, I mean, the people that are denying.
Wait, so just to address that, Wikipedia is a resource of references. So if you just go to the Wikipedia, they have these things with the brackets, the numbers, where they're academic peer-reviewed journals of the actual scientists who reviewed the articles and said, here, these are quotes from the scientists. This isn't quotes from Wikipedia. This is quotes from the scientists, which is what Wikipedia does. It's just an easy reference for the actual papers. This is good evidence that it doesn't work. These are the quotes from the people who reviewed his actual work in the peer-reviewed journals and found they didn't work. These are the reasons they said it didn't work. So it's not accepted by the consensus. And I mean, I don't need the wiki to tell you that. I can just look at the Phil Survey's paper of the polls of all the philosophers and scientists and neurologists and biologists. None of them accept reincarnation. So his papers obviously didn't work as a compelling metric to convey the experts who were qualified to assess whether or not the evidence actually works. This is not evidence.
Even if someone's an expert, they can still have biases, and these experts who read this, they may be presupposed to the idea of reincarnation in the first place, so they find it objectionable.
We'll have to have a debate on that topic. It's a whole topic of its own, and right at the moment, it's just an appeal to authority to say that the experts say it's not valid. We'd have to actually get into the whole arguments they give for why it's not valid, which I think is a whole debate all of its own.
No, if you list an authority who says he's provided evidence, then I get to list the consensus of experts who have assessed the evidence and said it's false. So you started with an appeal to authority by listing this guy and his evidence. And so I get to list the people who are qualified to assess whether it's true. That's kind of just how evidence works.
No, Eddie quoted the nature of his work and what it actually demonstrated and how he demonstrated it. For your reply to not be an appeal to authority, we'd have to actually have the way in which they fault their evidence. And I mean, you gave a list off of the Wikipedia website, which that could be valid, but we'd have to actually get into the details and see whether it is or not.
No, you listed papers that he published, and the only people who are qualified to assess the papers that he published are the experts. Like what you're saying may or not be true. It may or may not be an accurate representation. His study may be flawed. All of that is things that the experts assess, which is what I just quoted. So if you quote an authority a paper, papers are meant to convince the consensus of experts. If it goes to the consensus of experts, they say it's garbage, then it's garbage. They're the ones who are qualified. That's literally what the papers are for. It's not just to convince lay people who read the papers on Google. They're meant to be effective at convincing the experts in the field. That's the point of publishing papers. So if it fails at doing that, that is good evidence that the evidence in the paper fails. It's just how scientific review and peer review works. So if you list a paper, then the correct way to assess if the paper works is to look at the reception of the experts in the field. But I forgot what the point was you were making before that.
I can't remember. I was just saying we should have a debate on this topic another time. We gave his evidence. Bias, yeah.
So bias is one of the classical signs of pseudoscience, is that you claim that all of your dissenters have biases. That's never the case. Like nowhere in the papers does it say, well, we have biases, therefore we exclude this. They are all just, his papers are actually published in academic peer-reviewed journals, the Journal of American Medicine Association. They didn't reject his paper because of a bias. They accepted it and then tested it and found it to be unreliable. So no, there wasn't a bias here. It's just his methods failed.
Wait, who's going to say we're finding your paper unreliable because we have biases? Everyone's going to say we're finding your paper unreliable because of the reasons that we're telling you or telling ourselves why we're finding it unreliable.
No, if they accept it and publish the paper, that means they didn't find any methodological flaws in it just by reading the paper.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that their assessment that it's not reliable isn't based on a bias. It just means that the work was done to a high enough standard that it got published, and their bias wasn't strong enough to not publish it, but then they weren't happy with the results because it wasn't strong enough or there was errors with the evidence or the methodology or because of their bias. That remains to be seen. We'd have to actually look into their reasons.
No, again, so bias is never like the critical papers, like I have a bias, is not a criticism. You can't put that in an academic journal.
No, they don't give their bias as a reason. They give an ostensible argument.
The criticisms work the same way. You publish the criticisms in a journal. Bias isn't an option. You don't get to label bias as a potential reason that's false. That's an appeal to motive fallacy. Literally, bias does not in any way invalidate their arguments. Their arguments are true or false independent of the bias. Bias is just a fallacious reasoning that pseudoscience uses. You can't use bias.
But a bias sounds reasonable to other people who share the same bias, and nobody's going to pick up on it. It's like it's kind of like an echo chamber.
Bias isn't ever relevant. Like if I'm biased and I say 1 + 1 = 2, the statement is either true or false, independent of the bias. The bias doesn't matter at all. The truth of the arguments is either true or false, regardless of the bias. Bias doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. So if you have a methodology to demonstrate that some error in the paper or some methodological failure in the paper, which can be tested against all the other papers we just with the same standard, there's no bias here. This is the methodological practice we use in the field. It doesn't work in any other case. We're not going to let it work in this case either.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Let's look at the actual method and arguments. But you'd have to do more homework, and me or whoever's going to argue it would have to do more homework, and we could actually get into it rather than just saying, oh, this is what the experts are saying. I mean, have the consensus of experts ever been wrong?
Yes, but rarely.
Okay. I mean, historically, like every 10 years or 20 or 60 years, science changes 180 degrees, right?
Yeah, the consensus of experts is right more than anything else in human history ever. So it's definitely wrong in certain cases, but it's more right than literally any other method.
And when science has been wrong, there's always been somebody who's spoken out and said, oh, you guys are wrong.
by publishing a paper that was assessed by the consensus and accepted, and then changed the
No,
consensus.
often it didn't get accepted until after they died, or years later.
No, that's usually only the case because of usually religious indoctrination. Like Einstein's was published, and it took about 6 months for him to be recognized, accepted by the consensus because he made a testable prediction, which is confirmed. So, definitely in the past, where people were religious indoctrination and didn't accept ideas that were against religious things, that was true. Not the case today. In the case today, if you have a methodological demonstration, it's pretty much accepted if it can be.
Anyway, I should probably
corrected.
let Adi Purusha debate and sit back. Somebody pointed out how Arjuna's too passionate and can't help but get involved. This shows his bias.
I forgot what we were even.
Oh, we were talking about reincarnation and the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, and then TJump offered his objections, and then I jumped in pointing out how it's an appeal to authority, and we had some back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, forgot about that. Appeal to authority is only fallacious if it's a false authority. Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy Fallacies number 9. Consensus of experts is not a false authority. It is completely legitimate to appeal to the consensus of experts to assess the credibility of a paper.
Only if the subject matter is unintelligible to the public.
No.
If it's intelligible to the public, then the public is able to assess whether or not the expert's opinion is valid or not, because by virtue of them being able to comprehend the matter.
No, it doesn't work that way. It's like the consensus of experts is the consensus of experts, regardless of whether or not it makes sense to the public. It's still
That sounds religious
valid
to me.
evidence. The consensus of experts who have devoted their lives to studying the field can actually assess the evidence in the field.
If there's something that I have epistemic access to that I can understand, and I'm not allowed to do that, I just need to take what the clergy says and what they teach in the seminaries. That's religious. The clergy here being the scientists and the seminaries being the universities.
So what I said was the consensus of experts is evidence. They're not a false authority, so it is good evidence to appeal to the consensus in all fields. Like if they're the consensus.
Yeah, but let's say all the experts are telling us that Roundup doesn't cause cancer. All the studies are published. Roundup doesn't cause cancer. You look at the study like, oh, they were going to do a 9-month study, and then they did a 6-month study, and then they made it a 3-month study because anything longer than 3 months, all the rats were dying of cancer. They published a 3-month study. It looks fine. All the experts agree it doesn't cause cancer. Years later, they're all going to court for billions of dollars because it causes cancer. Like the public.
Yes. Yeah, so if all the experts are saying that it doesn't cause cancer, then until you do a study that demonstrates otherwise, they're right.
But you can look at their study and say they did a 3-month study. 3 months is not a sufficient study to determine if a chemical causes cancer in rats. That's a poor methodology. That's how you construct a study if you wanted to prove that it doesn't cause cancer, even though it does, so that you can get paid big bucks.
Again, until you do a study that can demonstrate your claim, you're just making stuff up.
You don't need to do a study in order to fault something else. Like, if I'm on the bus and the bus driver gets me to where I'm going, that I can know that the bus driver knows what he's doing. If he doesn't get me to my destination, I can know that the bus driver doesn't know what he's doing. And similarly, I can look at a study and figure out if the person knows what they're doing, if they're not, with a minimum of intelligence.
No, you can't. Anyone who thinks that you're more qualified than the experts is a moron. Like, no, you cannot. You're not more qualified than the experts. If you want to disagree with the experts, you need to do a study and demonstrate that your claim is the correct one, and then get them to accept it. You can't just say, "Well, I can read the study and know better than the experts." Like, no, that's ridiculous.
Anyway, we should move on. Was there another point you wanted to mention?
I mean, it seems like basically. There's nothing. Okay, your criteria is that something has to be proven with you have to somehow have a
differentiate imagination from reality.
Yeah, and I guess my claim is that I'm not necessarily claiming with absolute certainty that theism is absolutely true. It's the only possible explanation that can be. I'm merely mentioning that it's fully within your rights as a rational human person to accept the claim that belief in Krishna is legitimate. I mean, sure, you can offer one possible explanation that, it's illusory, or, you can't prove this, you can't prove that. But I think the point remains that you haven't done anything to conclusively deny the possibility that you could be having genuine religious experiences, that you are genuinely receiving God. I mean, maybe it's a difference of how you approach it epistemologically. I mean, you can maybe say that we should not accept anything unless we can, I guess my claim is that it's at least rational. I mean, it is still a possibility, genuine possibility that you are indeed perceiving God when you're chanting His name. That the experiences you're having are indeed legitimate.
Well, it seems like your only criterion for rational is it's logically possible, and by that criterion, it's rational for me to believe that I am the smartest person to have ever lived. It's rational for me to believe there's $1 billion in my bank account. It's rational for me to believe there are Klingons hiding on the other side of the planet. It's rational for me to believe that there are aliens abducting cows. The fact that it's logically possible does not make it rational. So if you want to justify your claim that religion is rational, you need to demonstrate that you have proportional evidence to show it's not just imaginary, because otherwise every imaginary thing is rational by that definition, which is why most philosophers don't accept that as rational. Rational is you need a proportional amount of evidence to the claim that you're making, and you don't have that. So it would not be rational unless you can provide a way to differentiate imagination from reality.
And I guess the criterion that I've advanced basically. I'm trying to gather my thoughts. I guess well, the criterion that I advanced to sort of distinguish these things, you just simply the level of sort of skepticism you've committed yourself to is just quite rather high to be able to accept much of anything spiritual at all.
Well, no, I've given like several examples where we could literally show spiritual things using my method if they were not
Yeah, but
imaginary.
your method is like if I chant Hare Krishna, I should get like a golden brick, but that's just not how spirituality works.
Just a single example I made up on the top of my head. So the golden brick is just a novel prediction. Any novel prediction would work as evidence. It's the same criterion as anything. So again, you can't blame my method. Like there's nothing overly skeptical about my method at all. It's that you just don't have evidence. You want if I lowered my standard to accept your claim, then I would also have to accept homeopathy, miracles done by voodoo, all kinds of ridiculous things that we know are false. So my standard eliminates things that are purely imaginary, and yours is also just imaginary. Until you can actually provide a way to differentiate imagination from reality, you have nothing. Just saying that my standard is too stringent isn't an argument. It's just an admittance that you don't have any evidence. Because my standard admits everything. Only omits things that we can all demonstrate are just imaginary. So miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, because none of them have been demonstrated. So again, just arguing that my method is too skeptical isn't evidence at all for your claim whatsoever.
We'll take questions soon, but maybe we can just wrap up or summarize the points. Do you want to give a summary of your arguments, Adi Purusha?
Yeah, I guess through chanting you can get a spiritual experience of God, and there's nothing really that sort of rules out the possibility that when you're chanting and perceiving God, that it's delusory or hallucination. There's nothing, at least I would argue, nothing really compelling to make it seem so unrealistic that it could possibly be a genuine experience of God, that it should cause you to give up that belief as irrational, that your perceptual experiences of God are there's nothing I think that really commits you to accept that your perceptual experience of God, when you're getting when you're increasing the moral character, you're having moral transformation, when you're experiencing results, when it's self-evident to you that the experiences you're getting are a different phenomenal type than material experiences. When there's all these sort of factors at work, I think you could say it's a possibility that it's imaginary, but given the content of the experience that you're experiencing itself, I think it's you're still rational and holding it to at least be possible that it's grounded in God.
Do you want to give a summary?
So,
TJump, your
sure.
point's kind of the same the whole way through. You've got your slogan.
So all of the evidence he presented was called an anecdote. It's called an anecdotal fallacy. We know those do not differentiate imagination from reality, because anecdotes indicate many, many imaginary things that aren't real. And so that method does not work to differentiate imagination from reality. So it's not evidence that it's true. It's just using a method we know fails more often than not, and then trying to say that that's justification, that we use this terrible method to conclude that his God is real. So it seems obviously is flawed and clearly unreasonable to use that method to justify belief in a God.
All right. So I've got this fancy way of bringing comments up on the screen now, thanks to
Oh, that's
Josh
interesting.
Wolf and Dimitri, who did the graphic design for it. So we've got Franks92. How often or for how long do you need to chant Hare Krishna in order for the experience to occur? TJump, when he debated, Josh Wolf chanted Hare Krishna twice. Was that enough?
There's certain conditions you need to meet. You have to have your heart open to God. You have to do it in an open spirit, not challenging the existence of God. If you do it if your attitude isn't right, you could do it for lifetimes and not get anything. Or if you're serious, you could do it for a few months and start to perceive the effects. A few weeks, maybe even experience the effects. It's hard to give a hard and fast rule, but if you're genuinely serious, then rather quickly you can get it within couple of years, I guess, on the upper end, but even as short as a few weeks, I'd say.
I know you're all wondering how to use this way, bringing comments up on the screen for your live streams, so I'll make a tutorial video soon. Ronald Mendonca, no one is saying you're not having an experience. How do you tell it's God or not Satan or an alien or just human experience when you chant Hare Krishna?
I would say that in the same way that you can distinguish, we have this intuitive ability to distinguish between different types of experiences. I can distinguish pleasure from pain, for example. I think God has endowed us so that we also have the ability to distinguish between a genuine spiritual experience that once we experience it, we know it's genuinely spiritual, and from a material experience that we have familiarity with. I think it's hard to prove that from an outsider perspective, but internally you can see the difference for yourself quite easily.
Charles in Solo, why aren't you one of the 36,000 different Christian sects?
Because we don't believe in eternal damnation, for example. We don't believe that there's only one way to the God and everyone else is wrong. We think that God is every religion basically, most of them are basically aimed at worshiping the same God as a person. They may have some differences over how they conceive him. They may have some differences in their theology, but at the end of the day, they're aimed at worshiping the same person.
Oh, no, sorry, that wasn't a question.
So if you were born in, for example, Texas or something, do you think you'd be a Christian?
I mean, I was born in North Carolina. I'm not a Christian. They're both fairly Christian states, so.
I was a Christian growing up, and I was too philosophical for that. I took philosophical issue with it, and was very satisfied with the Hare Krishna philosophy. Someone's asked, Arpit is asking TJump, what exactly do you mean by the word demonstrate? I think he's kind of explained that, but we can summarize it again quickly.
Yeah, difference between imagination and reality, just some way that we can, if you imagine it, it's the case, and you can make a prediction about what something's going to happen in the world, and you can do a test and confirm it, that would be a demonstration.
A question for Adi. Did you grow up with this belief? If not, what convinced you to start believing?
Yeah, no, I didn't really grow up as a Hare Krishna. I didn't really have much of a religious. I mean, my parents were kind of like Hindus, but it was very, I never knew much of anything. I didn't really do much religious things, but basically some events in my life happened. I began to earnestly seek out God, and I started reading the Bhagavad Gita, and I felt convinced, and I started practicing and doing the spiritual practice, and that further reinforced my conviction. And since then, I can, at least my own personal experience is that, God's there, he reciprocates with you, and you can perceive his presence in your life. I have maintained that conviction. It's hard to communicate externally, but within yourself internally, you can just sort of know.
Frank, so I have to chant Hare Krishna for this undisclosed period of time in order to find results. And if I don't get results, then what?
I mean, you have nothing to lose from it.
I'd say that they weren't doing it right somehow.
Yeah, the thing is, it's not like you mix this amount of you put this chemical with that chemical, you get this chemical, or you put two halves together, you get a whole. Two half circles together, you whole circle. It's not like God is a person, so he's not. It's not like a very deterministic thing. It really depends on your own free will. But I think if your heart is open, you'll get the results. And if for some reason your heart is closed off from it, you'll at least make some advancement from it spiritually, even if you don't perceive it. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of on up to you also. It's not like a deterministic thing.
So in order to get evidence for God, I must believe for it. That's first. That seems backwards. It's a continuation.
Not necessarily believe like, okay, God exists, but you should at least be open. At least if you're open and you're open to the idea, then you stick to it and commit yourself with some sincerity, then you should get results. It also helps if you keep company of people who are also practicing, because they're that can sort of it helps actually. There's some sort there's power in doing it with other people.
So a question for TJump, from Ram. Do you accept that there is a chance that God exists, and in that case, wouldn't it make it rational to practice religion because that chance exists?
No, the fact that there's a chance that I believe yes, it's possible that there could be a God that exists, but the fact that it's possible does not make it rational. Rational does not mean it's possible, because again, if just it being possible made something rational to believe, then it would be rational for me to believe I'm the smartest person in the world, I'm the tallest person in the world, there are magical leprechauns in my back pocket, I have $1 billion in my bank account. Like, just the fact that it's possible, none of those beliefs would be rational to believe just because they're possible. Possibility does not make something rational.
All right, I think that's it for the questions. I guess we can wrap up here. So Adi Purusha offered some arguments from experience and fine-tuning argument, and TJump saying none of those meet his criteria for being differentiated from imagination by being able to produce novel, testable predictions. Is there any final points either of you would like to make?
I think we sort of said all we can say.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. I appreciate the opportunity. Always fun to be here.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for coming on again. Thank you, Adi. Good luck with your PhD.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks
we'll
for having me.
We'll have to have a debate on the problem of evil sometime, because that's what his PhD's on. And if you're watching this live, be sure to tune in tomorrow. I'm having a discussion with Dr. Graham Oppy. It was supposed to be Dr. Howard Resnick having the discussion, but he's needing to rest. He's got a history of heart disease and stroke, and the doctors are telling him he needs to relax. And he's got a lot on his plate without doing these YouTube events that I'm coordinating. So he's pulled out, and it's going to be me and Graham Oppy. So wish me luck. It should be a good quality discussion, because Dr. Oppy is such an amazing intellectual. And that's us for today. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.